Um, let me welcome everybody to this CHOL, or Cholik as I call it, which is the Community History Online International Conference. I think it's magic that we can all be together from wherever we are with our connections to the South African Jewish community. And I'm very pleased that together with Gavin Morris and Adam Mendelsohn at the museum and at the Kaplan Center, we've been able to create with Eli Rabinovitz in Perth, Australia, me in London, this little organization, bringing together all those people who are working on the history of Jewish communities, but doing something about it online. You know, who knows how permanent online is, but at least we're working to put things together and tell stories that if we didn't do it, they might be lost. These are stories of the little people. They're not stories of the famous people. They're the stories of the people who contributed to the lives of South African Jewish communities. So I'm Geraldine Auerbach. I'm in London. My role has been in this sphere has been to create with Eli the Kimberley website, which is still an ongoing process as more and more families come in and want to talk. So today we have a wonderful session. We have 4 talks. We've got, first of all, is going to be Bramie Lenhoff, who grew up in Upington, now living in Delaware, who's going to tell us about Upington. We have Roy Ogus, who is presenting about South African special interest group of the Jewish genealogy and showing us what resources are available. He also produces a wonderful journal, but we'll talk more about it when it's his turn. Then we will have Rabbi Moshe Silverhaft, who is involved with so many of the small communities in South Africa. And finally, Shauna Sullivan, a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker, is going to talk to us. So if I can ask, I'm going to introduce you to Bramie, who grew up in Upington, studied at UCT and in the United States, where he's been teaching chemical engineering in Delaware since 1980. And he's involved with various South African and Latvian genealogy groups. And I'll let him tell you about the wonderful website that he's made documenting the story of the Jews of Upington. Bramie.
Thanks very much, Geraldine. Can you hear me okay? And can you see the slide?
Perfect, perfect.
And can you see the red pointer?
Yes.
Okay, well, thanks very much for joining us. And I'd especially like to thank Geraldine for initiating the process of bringing this group together and making an organization out of it. As she said, I will tell you a little bit about the modest Upington website I have, which pales in comparison to some of the other town websites that there are. But I think for this audience, with the exception of a couple of people, there's probably a limit to how much you want to hear about Upington. And really my main message today is that it really isn't that difficult to put together a little website like this, especially for a small town. And I'd like to convince those of you who came from small towns to memorialize your now gone Jewish community by doing something similar. And I'll try to show you some of the sources. So I'll start the story by not so much in Upington and not even in South Africa, but telling you how I started doing this and why. So I'll start off with a long way away, which is in Latvia, so this is where all my ancestors came from. in Kurland, and my mother came from this town called Goldingen over here. And when we were kids, she used to talk about her childhood in Goldingen, and with Goldingen being behind the Iron Curtain, for all practical purposes, this was a totally mythical place. And then suddenly 1990 arrived and you could go there. And in 1995, I went to Latvia for the first time, armed with the information from my mother and with some of her 1930s era photos. And sure enough, I could identify the shul and the Jewish school, but obviously there really wasn't anything that you could consider Jewish life left in Goldingen. Now, fast forward a couple of decades, and in about 10 years ago, I went back to Upington for the first time in about 20 some years, and I was encountered with the same situation. You know, I knew where everything was, so I could see the leftovers of the Jewish institutions, but there really wasn't any Jewish life there. Now, I've got to be very careful how I say this, because there's obviously no equivalence at all between how and why Jewish communities ended in Eastern Europe and how and why they ended in South Africa. But for someone showing up in town a couple of decades after the fact, you're really facing the same situation of seeing nothing left of the actual community, but you can find some of the leftovers. And it's those communities that I think it's important to recognize. I should also add that the shul in Upington was built exactly 100 years ago this year. And for me, it's really sad to see it looking like this. Anyway, a difference between the Eastern European communities and a place like Upington is the age of the community. The Eastern European communities had been around for hundreds of years. And most of the South African communities were around for on the order of 100 years. And this is an interesting reality in itself. And I think it's nicely reflected in this foreword by Dan Jacobson from a collection of Yiddish short stories from South Africa. And I don't expect you to read all of this, but he writes about his father riding in a Boer commando early in the First World War and riding into Kenhardt, and his father noticing a building that looked suspiciously like a shul. And he said the most remarkable thing about this, and he mentioned several different elements, is really that Kenhardt, of all places, should at that time have had a sufficiently large Jewish community to warrant having a shul. But that's really what it was like in those days, in the sense of people arriving from God-forsaken corners of Eastern Europe into God-forsaken corners of South Africa, making a living with the proverbial brass farthings with which they arrived, and really many of them doing exceptionally well, others doing less well, but living their lives in that way. And really, when I go to the Upington Cemetery, I always think of Gray's Elegy, because here are people who lived unsung lives, but did their honest best. It's important for us to recognize these communities. There are plenty of unsung heroes in Maitland and Pinelands and West Park as well. But I think the Jewish communities were somewhat different. Now, of course, the Jewish community, the small communities have been recognized beautifully in the set of Country Communities books, which I think has been a remarkable accomplishment. And I certainly don't want to minimize the contribution. I think in the Upington pages, they especially found some absolutely fascinating, really early history, and I've got no idea where they found that. But I think it was in Gwen Robbins's talk last week that she was talking as a true believer in books about why the online presence can complement what's in the books, both by creating a living environment for elaborating on the history, but also to provide a more fine-grained description of what was there and to add more color to the history. And this is the nature of what it would be good to cover for more of the South African country communities. The differences between the small towns and the cities, because the cities are certainly worth commemorating as well, the communities really were different. The most obvious difference is size, but I think those of us who come from small towns know that everyone knew everyone else. They also knew everyone else's business, which is another story. But there were some other subtler issues that I think are made the communities distinctive. There were a lot of clusters of relatives and landslide, and so there was almost no one in the community who was disconnected from anyone else. The photo here is of the Nurek brothers and some of the employees. These are the two brothers. Some of the people in the front row are their relatives and children, but in some of the other people were people they brought out to Upington to work in their businesses and essentially saved them from what might have been a horrible fate in the Holocaust. So the Nureks were also from Golding, and they were my mother's cousins. This is Janke Levinson. Over here is Gustav Gottschalk, and they were both from Golding as well. And so the communities were much more connected than you would find in a larger community. I would argue that there was less social stratification. I won't say there was no social stratification, but I'd say there was less. It was a much more egalitarian environment. The institutions were small, they were so small that everything had to be run by volunteers. At times there was a permanent rabbi employed, but everyone else was a part-timer. The Chevra Kadisha would basically have something to do when someone died once a year. So having a permanent employees or anything like that, there were no such permanent institutions. And so the community was the community. There wasn't a bureaucracy on the one hand and the community on the other. And then the last point is the totally disproportionate contribution of the Jewish community to the local economy. I think that there were certainly the OK Bazaars and other Jewish-owned businesses all over the country. But in South Africa, in the small towns, just as in the small towns of Eastern Europe, the Jews really dominated the economy, and the proportions in terms of population were much smaller in the Jewish small towns. This is a history, a relatively recent history of the Northern Cape, and it includes this oral history by a man named Alfred Gabula, who was active in the anti-apartheid movement in Upington. And he describes what Upington was like when he arrived in the 1950s, and said the businesses were mostly owned by Jews. And then he goes on in this long paragraph describing all the different businesses, not all of them, but this first story, OK Lenhoff's, wasn't actually owned by my family, but John Goldberg is on the call. His father was a partner in K. Lenhoff's, but they totally dominated the economy. And so what you have left is a really distinctive way of life. The Jewish traders, for instance, really kept everyone in town afloat in the 1930s during the drought and depression by the credit they issued to everyone in the community. And so this is the kind of environment that it's good to be able to recognize and to record, including down to the individual family level. So this is sort of the background that I start with, and that's the how and the why I'm interested in doing this sort of thing. The what I actually did started off in a very small way. So it started off really from one photo, and that's this iconic photo, which represents a community function on Israel Bar Mitzvah in 1961. And this was my generation, but this was also basically the last of the high water mark of the size of the community, because it was after this point that everyone ended up leaving town. And so I posted just on a little single web page a few photos of Upington through the decades, starting with this one and then going back to this photo, which I had found in the archives in Cape Town, of a picnic on the island in 1910. And since John Goldberg is on the call, I believe his grandparents are here. So this was what I posted, and I sent out emails to the Upington diaspora, and there was some interesting exchanges, and that was how it was. And as all of you know, we all stay in touch with many of our friends and acquaintances, but in the small towns, everyone is sort of in touch with everyone else in different ways. And then I realized that I actually had a lot more information, and I thought I should put that up too. And I decided to do that on a website through JewishGen, through what was then called Links. It's now called KehilaLinks. And the reason for doing that was mainly the bus theory, namely, what if I fall under a bus tomorrow? Who's going to keep the website going? And so with KehilaLinks and JewishGen, there's the promise of continuity. And so that's where I started putting all the other stuff that I had and started looking for other information. And I'm going to present this in the form of saying where I got the information, and mainly in the interests of encouraging others to do something similar. So the community started in, this is an article in the Jewish Chronicle from London from 1896, when the Harris brothers organized a high holiday services, and this was written up in the Jewish Chronicle. Jewish Chronicle is a great source. The indexing isn't perfect, but the back issues are indexed, and you can go and look at the old articles about your community. There are other newspapers too. This is the local Upington Rag. This is the Zionist Record. There's of course the Jewish Times. These generally aren't well indexed, and for something like this, even the current publisher of the newspaper doesn't have the back issues, but so it would take hard work of going to the South African Library and getting all the back copies and wading through them, but it's something that's doable. I can highly recommend the experience of going to archives and dealing with primary documents. There's the feel and the smell that is great. This is one that I found in the Cape Archives. This was a written application by members of the Upington community in the early 1900s for a grant of land, which was granted by a resolution of the Cape Parliament in the mid 1900s. The CHOL was only built after the First World War, but these are the kinds of documents that you can find in the archives. For Upington, most of those would be in Cape Town, but some in Pretoria. In the British archives, there's actually an interesting set. They're useless for Upington because, strangely enough, Upington wasn't attacked during the Boer War. But these are from Kennard, not too far from Upington. These are the town guard records for the British forces. And for Kennard, about 20% of the names listed here were Jewish. Including Udall Brenner, who was also from Goldingen, and the Nurik's cousin. This is another source. A really important archival source is for vital records, and these are, for instance, marriage records and death records. There are also death records that are related to the estate that provide much more genealogical information. Now, you don't have to go to the archives to get those, because the Mormons have done everyone a favor of going to microfilm all of these records. Now, why the Mormons are doing it is a topic on its own, but when I copied some of these, I had to order the microfilms from Salt Lake City and go and read them on the microfilm readers at my local Mormon church. Nowadays, the Mormons have put all of these on their website, familysearch.org. If you're looking, many of them have been indexed, but if you're trying to collect the names of everyone, of all the marriage records in Upington or a small town, they're organized geographically, and there are few enough of them that you can wade through a few decades worth of these records in a few hours and make copies, and you've got all the marriage records. And so these are the sorts of things that you can get from the archives. The Genealogical Society of South Africa has photographed many cemeteries. all the graves in the Upington Jewish Cemetery have been photographed. Coverage is kind of spotty. Not all cemeteries, not all towns have been covered. Some towns have been covered only partially, but there's an enormous amount of detailed names, dates, and everything like that that you can get. And of course, you can link to these gravestone photos, as I've done on this Upington website, so that every grave is accompanied by or every burial is accompanied by a gravestone photo. Now, there's a lot of detailed genealogical information here, but in terms of the life of the community and the life of the individual, the really interesting part of what's written here is in the hyphen. And that's the part that I would really like to have covered on the website. People like Geraldine, our gracious hostess here, and Gary Sussman in Freiburg, Dave Bloom for Zimbabwe, have done amazing jobs in collecting information on individual families. There are a couple of sources of information I've plumbed to get some information on the community. One is that most of the congregation records have been deposited in the UCT library, and so I've photographed a lot of these records. They include the Union of Jewish Women records, such as the ones that Karen Coleman spoke of last week. There's Gavin Morris, I think it was last week, who warned us about the subjectivity in some of the minute taking, but there's some really interesting information here just about what motivated the community. Their Jewish identity was really important to them. There were complaints in almost every meeting about the poor job that the rabbi was doing in teaching the children Hebrew and Jewishness. My favorite is this little extract at the bottom of the page, which says, complaining about the rabbi and saying, during the period of his tuition, and then in Yiddish, seinen ausgewachsen as Shtetl Paurim, which basically means we've raised a shtetl full of Gentiles, just complaining about the job that the rabbi was doing. So there's a lot of community color in here. It would take someone a while to go through and really distill it and filter it to create a history, and I haven't had the time or the instinct and the ability to do that. But the other thing that I've done more recently has been to follow Geraldine and Gary's leads in just asking families to prepare a page that describes their family history, what they did in Upington, and where they came from, that sort of thing. As Geraldine was saying earlier, sometimes it's quite difficult to get people to do things. And so this is still a work in progress, but these are the sorts of things that you can get done. I've started writing little stubs of family pages, and in the interest of trying to get the process going, but there's more to be done yet. So let me finish off because my time is up. There are a couple of things that I've discussed with a couple of other people, but haven't done yet. One is the one that I've discussed with Marvin Cohen, who prepared the page I showed on the previous slide. And that's to prepare a map showing which properties in Upington were Jewish businesses, Jewish homes, and so on. This isn't Upington, this is Bangkok, this is a tourist thing, but you can do this very easily on Google Maps or OpenStreetMap. The other one, I think, is a more interesting one, and it's what I call a linkage map. A linkage map is actually a technical term in genetics. I don't mean that, but it's reflected, what I do mean is reflected in this other diagram from the biological sciences, where you can show each family as being a circle and then show which families were related to which. So these could be siblings, this could be a cluster of people all from the same shtetl, these could be business partners. But I think it's the sort of thing that you could never do in a city like Cape Town, or it's probably difficult even in Kimberley, but it's something where almost the number of circles that are shown here would be about the number of families that lived in Upington. So let me finish with a few links to other websites that can be useful. This is Saul Isroff's, again, inspired by Mendel Kaplan. You can also track where many of your ancestors, the people in the town, came from through the records on Jewish Gen, especially the Latvia and Litvak SIGs. And then KehilaLinks is where I have the Upington website, but Geraldina has a Kimberley, but then Eli Rabinowitz has a whole lot of small towns represented as well. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to respond, and he has my contact information. So thanks very much for the opportunity and for listening, and I'd be happy to take any questions if there's any time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bramie. I think you've given us a beautiful overview and insight, and made us really feel interested in knowing more about these people and the places. So if you'd like to ask a couple of questions, please either raise your virtual or thing hand. Do you want to stop your share now, Bramie? And then if we're all on gallery view, we'll be able to see everybody very nicely, and I'll be able to see. I think, Rabbi, you had a hand up. Was that true? Would you like to?
That's right. Bramie, congratulations on an incredible presentation, and your efforts are wow. It's you just hit the nail on the head. It's brilliant how you put it all together. So you're well done for that. I wanted to ask you, in your research, did you ever come across the burial register of the Upington Cemetery?
No, I didn't. In the EGGSA photos, there's a mention, because there's one grave without a date, and they listed a date on their website, and I could only think that they might have gotten it from the municipality, but the UCT archives don't have the burial register.
Because they have, one of the things we do is look after Jewish cemeteries around South Africa, and Upington has a particularly large amount of unmarked graves.
Oh, I didn't realize that was an unusually large number.
Yeah, and so
on the website, I did find death certificates for about, I think, 8 people that said where the death certificate said they were buried in Upington, but there isn't a corresponding marked grave, and so there may be a match there.
Is that for all 8 that you're talking about? All 8?
All 8 were like that. There was at least one other that were where the death was in Upington, but I know that the burial was elsewhere.
All right, so I'll ask Colin for your, Gavin. I'll ask Gavin for your email address, and we'll communicate, because it's very important that as many graves and individuals are recorded as possible.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And thanks for your kind comments.
Anybody else like to raise a virtual hand? You go to reactions and it says raise your hand. Gwyn, do you unmute and talk to us? Okay.
I've just come across this little card. It says, I'll scan it in and send it to you. It says, presented to Advocate Morris Alexander, KCMP, on the opening by him of the Jewish Communal Hall at Upington in the King George V Memorial Street, 3rd of June, 1937. I'll scan it in and send it to you.
Oh, that's Jewish no, I remember the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
What was presented to him? What was presented to him?
It was either a key or one of these memorial shovels. We've got, the court has it framed in the elbow.
Now, I remember from my childhood, the cornerstone on the communal hall said that it was officially opened by Advocate Alexander in 1936-37, and the records of that are also in the minute books.
And the actual memorial stone, memorial stone, what happened to that? Did they ever remove it?
I don't know. The shul has been incorporated into this business, yeah. But I think the hall was demolished. Some of the artifacts are in the local museum in Upington. I don't remember if I saw the cornerstone there, but I would like to think that they would have preserved that.
I'll ask Raymond. I'll let you know.
Thanks.
Now, a very interesting thing about cemeteries, I've been in touch with Larry Galinsky, Larry Galinsky created the most amazing virtual cemetery for Cape Town. And Eric Berger spoke to us in our last session of this about doing this. Now, Larry is perfectly happy to extend this to communities in South Africa who would like it, because I don't know if you remember it, you can look up a person, you can see a picture of the person, a picture of the gravestone, the details of when they died, you can leave a stone by the grave, you can donate a leaf for their tree of life. And this is an extraordinary and wonderful thing, particularly for small communities in South Africa where nobody's left or hardly anybody, and we're all over the world. So I wonder, you know, Rabbi, whether we could talk more about how we could make use of this. All they need is the documents of the graves and they can all set it up. And
Okay,
it's really would be something extraordinary.
who did you mention? What was the name?
The name is Larry Galinsky, and I can put you in touch with him, who worked with a media media company in South Africa called Data Smart, who created this website. And if nobody's seen it, just look up Cape Town Cemeteries Board, and you'll find this amazing website of South African Jewish graves. So thank you again, Bramie, for a really wonderful presentation. Gwen, did you want to say something else?
Yes, I spent some time at UCT before they had the fire, in which I went through the books of the small Cape country communities, making a list of the names of all the people buried in the cemeteries there. I could make a list available to whoever's interested.
Thanks. No, well, they've got the Cape Town. It's the list of
No, these are country communities, not Cape Town.
Oh, fantastic. Yes, brilliant. Thank you so much. So now, if we may, let us go on.
Can I just ask Gwen, sorry, is that, where did that information, is it from a register or from pictures? Where is it from?
They were from the minute books of the communities. They had death registers, from the death registers.
Okay.
Veronica would know whether those books were burnt or not.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the interesting discussion afterwards. I'd now like to move to the overview of the Southern African Special Interest Group, and this is going to be presented by Roy Ogus. And Roy has been involved in Jewish genealogy for a long time, and he was born in South Africa, but now lives in San Francisco Bay Area, a member of, guess what, I printed this out over something else. So what I would like to say, that he's the editor of the South Africa SIG, the Special Interest Group Journal. And this is an amazing piece of information that I feel is rather hidden. And I would like to see a way of, you know, maybe Roy, once a month, we can just put an article on the website, or not that website. We've got this interactive email group, put one article, and then let's see what discussion comes. Just drawing attention to that wonderful thing that you've done. And Roy is an engineer by profession. And Roy, please tell us about Southern African Special Interest Group. And yeah.
Okay, thanks, Geraldine. Let me first share my screen so you can see what I'm talking about. Okay, do you see my screen?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay. All right, so as Geraldine mentioned, I'm going to be talking about what we call the Southern African Special Interest Group, SA-SIG. And so I'm not going to really be talking about my own research per se. I'm going to cover two sections really in this talk. The first part below, above the line here is indeed about the SA-SIG. So I will explain a lot more about what is involved there, what resources we have, and I will go into a lot more detail about the journal that Geraldine mentioned. I would like to, if there's time at the end, talk a little bit about some collateral information that I've put together on a way to find records, South African records, both online as well as in other areas. And this is something I've presented in more depth in other forums, but I thought it might be interesting just to show this information here. Just a few words before I proceed with the first part. I actually, as Geraldine said, was born and grew up in South Africa, but I have been living in the United States since the 1970s, a long time. When I was growing up, I knew very little about my extended family or history. For some reason, I didn't know many members of my family at all. And also, as is common with people, young people at that time, you didn't ask questions. And I really got interested in my family when I was in the United States. And so at that point, most of the people in my family were not accessible to me or even alive at that point. And so I had to really put together the story of the history just from records and from resources. And at first I thought that was impossible being in the United States. How would you ever find information about South Africa? This was somewhat before the internet, which has made it a lot easier. But I really spent many, many years going through what is available, and I was pleasantly surprised at how much information was available. And so I have compiled all these resources in a separate talk and article, and I'll give you a link to that article, which really showed that one can indeed, and Bramie's talk gave you a preview into some of that too, about how you can find this information. But anyway, that's the backdrop of why I became interested. Actually, the real reason I became names like Ogus are likely to be related. And so whenever you saw a name, the name represented, you knew it was family. All right, so let me proceed. So what is this? The full name is Southern African Special Interest Group, which we call SA-SIG. It's really one of the collection of what Jewish Gen calls research divisions. Jewish Gen has a page which they list all the research divisions. There's the Southern African one. It used to be called Special Interest Group. So what is the history? So the SA-SIG was established in 1999, actually at the 1999 IAJS conference by Saul Isroff and Mike Getz. Saul became president at that time, Mike Getz vice presidents. Both of them, many of you know Saul and Mike. Both originally were South Africans, but Saul was living in the UK and Mike in the USA at the time. I became the vice president in 2005 after Mike retired. And as I mentioned, I'm also from South Africa. Original webmaster was Roger Harris, and Bramie took it over in 2018 and now manages our website. The newsletter, which is really a misnomer, its name is a misnomer, it's really a journal and a detailed journal. We actually commenced publication in January of 1999. And the first message that was posted in the SA-SIG discussion group was on the 25th of June, 1999. And if you look in the archives, here is that message, just, Paul said, just to test the first message, June 25th. Mike Getz provided many years of devoted service to the SA-SIG. Even after he had retired, he had many roles. He sadly passed away in Bethesda, Maryland, where he was living in 2018. I just wanted to mention two references, and I'll mention them at the end. Saul and I wrote an article in Shemot in 2012. It's a little dated, but really has pretty much all the interesting information about finding the resources. And that's available on the SA-SIG website. And there's also a compilation of key links for information also on the SA-SIG website, and that can be found, and I'll mention that later. All right, so what happened there? Sorry, this thing went out of. So back to the agenda. So let me quickly go through some boilerplate information that's on the website. Mission statement is shown on the website. I've shown it here. I just wanted to emphasize 2 points. One is one reason it's called the Southern African SIG and not the South African SIG is it really covers more than South Africa, but is interested in Jewish communities in the southern part of Africa, actually all the way up to the former Belgian Congo in Central Africa. And the other point on the mission statement is that it's mainly for genealogical purposes that the institution has been established, but there's more than institution, genealogical discussion, but also some of the social discussions related and personalities in the area. There's a list of all the goals, so that's what you would expect a special interest group to be pursuing, and you can read all of this on the website. In terms of the board, there's the names of the president and the vice president, Saul and myself. And we also have a number of what we call country coordinators. These are contact people in the different countries who someone could go to as a first contact for some particular information about the country. So we have Australia, Canada, Israel, and South Africa, people who still live in South Africa, and USA. So let me talk about the key activities of the SA-SIG. So there's really like 4 prongs. So the first is the very comprehensive website that we maintain, which is one of the Jewish Gen websites. And there's a comprehensive collection of resources with over a wide range of topic and mode of operation, really. There's many articles and commentaries. There are information files, directories, the very important archive of the newsletter, the journal that we mentioned before, various community files, youth movements, much more. And I'm going to give you a quick highlight on some of these pages. I just counted, there's over 60 separate web pages associated with the website. The second prong of the activities is, again, what we call the newsletter, but it's really a periodic journal of high quality and in-depth articles. And I'll show you a lot more about that. There is the discussion forum that is now merged as part of the Jewish Gen uniform discussion forum, and it uses the hashtag #South Africa for the discussions. And at least prior to the pandemic, all the IHAGS conferences, we'd have SA-SIG meetings where we went through a business meeting basically about the SA-SIG and have people talk about ideas that are of interest to them. Let me talk about the website. So let me first show you. So when you get into the website, you'll be presented with this homepage on the right. There's also a table of contents, and these are various items in the table of contents, and I'll show you just a snapshot of some of these. Throughout as I said, there's over 60 pages. There's also what's called a What's New section. This is very interesting to see what has been added to the website in recent times. So it's reverse chronologically ordered. And for each one of the updates to the website, you can see an entry here. And if you click on it, you go straight to that page that was updated. And so you can see here, there's a wide range of topics that has been updated recently. If you go to the articles and commentaries list, you see a diverse collection of it's a little diverse and not that organized, except in alphabetical order, basically. And here are just some examples of what is in that section. And there's also something called lists and directories. And these really are more links to resource descriptions or information rather than an article about something. Here's a continuation. That we have a somewhat strange page that we call the gallery page. These are interesting pictures or photos which we couldn't really figure out where else they should live. And so here you can see a list here. And let me just show you a few of these photos. So here's a photo of the 1950 meeting when the Israeli foreign minister and his wife visited Pretoria and had a meeting with the Pretoria Zionist Council executive. And they took this very historic picture with all the names there. And you can find that on the website with the names in the picture. And many of you will recognize the names as perhaps family members or parents of yours. The second one is a 1905 picture of a group of men in Pretoria. And this was a really old picture, again, with their names listed. I'm not sure where they were or what the circumstances were, but that picture is there. Here's a very interesting, this is actually something I own that I found in my father's memorabilia. It is a literal flag. It's a material, a cloth flag that dates from the first anniversary of the State of Israel, the celebration of the first anniversary in 1949. And all the people at this meeting signed this flag. And I posted the image of the flag there with all the signatures. We've identified almost like 98% of them. I think there are a couple of signatures we haven't identified, and that's on the gallery page as well. All right, so let me get to this discussion of the newsletter, which I hope this meeting will actually advertise it a little more per Geraldine's interest there. And certainly we could post a special article somewhere about the existence of the newsletter. But let me just show you about what we have and how you can find the information there. So I'm the editor, as mentioned. We've actually published it since January 1999 on a periodic basis. So in fact, here is the front page of the 1999 message, and it basically goes through the fact that we've just created the SA-SIG. This is Saul's president's message at the time, and talked about what the goals and the mission of this, which is now embodied on the web page. The articles cover a wide range of topics, and again, it's an in-depth journal. It's not just some recent news about it. These are some of the topics that are covered, all the way ranging from different communities in the country versus detailed research topics. We try to have book and periodical reviews of interest when something new about South Africa comes up. I actually had started a section a number of years ago, which I call New Items of Interest on the Internet. And I basically compile a list of internet locations or pages which contained information of interest to South African researchers. And actually a very interesting section is the letters to the editor, because we often get some interesting comments about previous issues. So the question is, how do you get a copy of this and how do you find old copies? Currently, our delivery is just a PDF file via distribution list. So people send a message to me and I add them to a distribution list, and when a new issue is produced, then I send it out to all of them. But we also have an archive on the web page, and I'm going to show you a little bit more how you can really find pretty much anything you want to find in the past issues on this website. So here is the link to the archive. We can access the archive in two different ways. One is in a browsing method. You could basically find each newsletter and you can see its table of contents or go directly to the complete newsletter. So this is what it looks like. If you go to that page, you see the list in reverse chronological order. And if you click on the left signal here, then you actually a PDF version of the complete newsletter comes up on your screen, and you can read it, or you can print it or save it. If on the other hand, you hover on the right-hand side, because you might be interested in what's in this issue, the table of contents just appears on your screen and you can see exactly what was in that newsletter. So typically what you would do is you would browse the table of contents. And if you see an article you find interesting, you would click on the left side and the article would come up. And this is what it would look like if you click on the left side. Here is the front page of the PDF file. This is the viewable PDF file of the whole newsletter. So here are a couple of recent table of contents. So for example, this one is 56 pages. The one on the right is 60 pages. So these are pretty extensive newsletter covering a wide range of topics. And just to whet your appetite for what's in these, I've just listed a few example pages there. So here's actually one published by Geraldine, and this is her story about the virtual city. And this was a 8 or 9 page in-depth article about what she called a virtual city and how to achieve it. Here's another one, and this is about Jonah David. I'm sure many of you know of his photography, and he had a project to capture emerging South African Jewish communities. These are more than in South Africa, that are now in the Beit HaTifusot Museum in Israel. Another one is the memories of a South African volunteer in the War of Liberation in Israel. Another one is, I came across 2 very interesting articles about Zimbabwe by a former South African living in England, and he just fascinating articles, and I presented an overview of them and links to the original articles. Here's another one. And did anyone know there was a kibbutz in Israel called Yam Smatz? So there's an article about that kibbutz there. And finally, the one other sample, this is a story about South Africans' work in Lithuania. But it actually talks about Abel and Glenda Levitt, who many of you know. Now, interesting, all these articles that I just showed you were in one single issue of the journal. All right, so what I showed you is how you browse through them. Now, what happens if you would like to actually search these archived issues? Well, it turns out I found a nice shortcut that a targeted Google search pretty much does what you want, and we didn't have to implement our own. And basically, a targeted search in Google is that you put your search term on the left here, any Google search term that you would normally use, but you specify a particular site to Google, and Google only looks at that site. And so that's the way you do it. So for example, if I had this search in Google for the keyword Kimberley, it could be any compound Google's search term, but if I put Kimberley, well, lo and behold, it comes up with a list several pages long of every newsletter that in the archive that has the word Kimberley. So not only can you click on that link that Google will return and you'll get the whole newsletter right in your browser, it also gives you the excerpt in the newsletter where the word Kimberley appeared. And so you can see that there. So this is a very rich way of finding archived material. So I pretty much produce the archive on my own. I'm always soliciting contributions from anyone who's interested. It could be either an original article that you've written, or it could be references to other published articles, and then I go through and get the permission. So just send me anything you have on that, and I'll be glad. I'm actually working on the next. The last one was a little far. There's been a gap since the last one that is longer than I'd care for, and I'm working on the next one now and hope to get one out in the next month or 2. All right, so that ends my SA-SIG discussion. And so I thought I'd quickly go through some online resources. We might run out of time, but let me just keep going. And I'm just going to highlight some of these. And these are all the resources that I found during my own research. So I list all the categories that I covered here, and I'm quickly go through them. So the first one is the Roots Bank, which I think most of you know, produced by the Kaplan Center at the Jewish Migration and Genealogical Study in Cape Town. And it covers the core families that migrated to Southern Africa between 1850 and 1950 from various parts of the world. And the research is focused on where did the families live originally, what is the migration patterns to South Africa and where they settled. And often they settled in rural areas, just like where they lived in the old country. And all this information is embodied in the database, which I think we all know. Here is the web page and the front page of the home page of the database. And so it's really the first place you want to look for if you want to search for South African information. What about burial records and gravestone images? So Joburg, the IHAGS project, has got a comprehensive amount of cemetery data for Johannesburg. Not all the smaller cemeteries are there, but most are available there. In most cases, it's just the information rather than an actual gravestone photo, but some do. And they will accept additional information. I'm sure many of you know about that. Cape Town actually has a very rich website maintained by the maintenance board, which has a directory for a number of Cape Town cemeteries. But the interesting thing is they typically have an actual gravestone photo there. GSSA, and I saw Bramie actually reference some of them, have also a large collection of gravestone images of South African grave sites or cemeteries. Many of them are not Jewish, excuse me, but there are some Jewish gravestones also found. Whoops, I don't know why it keeps going out of. And finally, family search. We also heard that in Bramie's talk has, excuse me, before I go to family search, there's a set of Jewish yearbooks that have been published. You can see the list here, a number of volumes. They are not generally available online, but we've created a searchable database for at least 2 of them, and we might add to that in the future. And so you can search that database on the SA-SIG site for these, for the names in these particular 2 databases. So family search is what I was heading to. Is it a wonderfully rich collection of South African records? I remember, as Bramie alluded to, in the old days, you would go and search through the Mormon or the FHL web microfilms, and yes, there was a lot of information there, but very tedious to access. More and more of them have been placed on the Family Search website now, including actual document images. And in fact, Family Search has now pretty much completed the digitization of the bulk of their films. So most of them are available, not all. And not only the information from the microfilms, they have got newer information that are not available on microfilm that they've also added to Family Search. Usually what they do is they place all of the images of the microfilms immediately on the website in browsable form, but then they go through an index phase and eventually a full search engine is provided. So it takes a little bit of knowledge and skill to go through the microfilm browsing, the online version of it, but you can find stuff if you know how to do that. And here's just a quick snapshot of collections that they have. Okay, moving on, I'm sensitive, I'm running to the end of my time frame. Ancestry also has a collection of South Africa, not as comprehensive as Family Search. You can see the list there, and you can actually interrogate them in the way you would interrogate any ancestry list. There are Facebook groups on South African genealogy that you can join and discuss questions or get input from others. There's something called the Poor Jews Shelter. This was a London-based temporary shelter for Jews that were traveling from Eastern Europe to other parts of the world, and a large number of the people that were housed in the shelter actually went to Southern Africa or South Africa between those years. And the Kaplan Center has created a database where you can search through the names of the names on the shelter. Some other sources, and I'm almost at the end. So I listed 4 categories here. Board of Deputies, that's the official central Jewish organizations in the country. It really represents to the government is the representative of all the major Jewish organizations and congregations. They have an extensive collection of information. Not all is compiled and made available on the internet. For example, they have 60 years collection of indexed newspaper clippings, and I've used that index very, very comprehensively, mostly by communicating with them. They've got Jewish and Yiddish publications. There was a wave of Jewish immigration to South Africa between 1924-29, a longer story why that happened. Basically, the US had closed immigration at that point. And this data has been added. It came from the Board of Deputies, but is now in the Roots Bank. And you can access them by email or go to their website. And there's been an article in the Shemot issue in 2012. South African Friends of the Beit HaTipusot in Israel have this compilation titled Jewish Life in South African Country Communities, a wonderful collection of country communities, resources on South African communities in those areas. As far as I know, this might be slightly out of date, that 5 volumes are available. These are pictures of the covers, and 3 are in the process of being ready. Then some of them might have already appeared. There are a number of museums, not necessarily for Jewish information. The Corey Library at Rhodes University has a wonderful collection of South African materials, and certainly the Jewish records are embodied in that. It's not Jewish records per se. I've used them extensively. There's actually a Jewish museum in Port Elizabeth called the Pioneers Museum. There's a Cape Town Jewish Museum, and the National Library of South Africa, the National South African Library, I think it's called, is also an excellent resource. And finally, the KehilaLinks, which we were already alluded to by Bramie and the rabbi, but is a collection of community information for a wide variety of communities all over the world, but there's an extensive community of South African towns. In fact, when I last checked it, there's this list of towns. Some of them are outside of South Africa, like Lorenzo Marx or Maputo. And there's a huge amount of information on that. Really, Eli Rabinovich, who's not in the meeting today, I don't think, but has been on former, is really the motivating or the driver behind this. And many others like Geraldine have been involved with this. And really, Eli thinks the quintessential site is the Kimberley site, which I've shown a list of, or at least shown the homepage and the list of the links. But that's, if you want to move to your town, you can find an enormous amount of information there. So that's really all I'd say. I want to again refer you to the 2 references that I have, the article that Saul and I wrote, and this collection, which is about a 5-page collection of interesting links. And certainly I'm available by email to answer any questions. And right now I'll be glad to take any questions if we have any time left. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Roy, for a wonderful overview. There's so much in this, and obviously you and Saul have been into this from early on and have provided so much resources. So if you want to stop share, then we'll see if there are a few questions for you before we go on. And then I can see if there are people with a hand up or whatever. I think it's really good that this is being recorded, because there's so much in it that I'm sure you'll want to reference again, and you'll be able to see it. And we also have this interactive email list. And if you're not on it, I hope that you're willing to be on it. If you send me your email address, I can put you on, or you can join it yourself. And, then we can keep publishing these things and show them. So I think, Roy, we'll go on now to Rabbi Silverhaft. If you already, Rabbi Silverhaft, as you know, I'm sure for the past 29 years, he's been South African only traveling rabbi, counselor, friend, one-man Chevra Kadisha, and romantic rabbi, all in one. And you're going to tell us about how online helps you. Rabbi Silverhaft.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. I don't have any presentation. I'm just going to talk, and if people want to put their hands up, we can do it during or after. I'm pretty easy with that. Just first of all, I want to say that I'm extremely encouraged by the previous two presentations. I think it's absolutely fantastic, the interest being shown to record and save the Jewish history of this incredible community that once thrived at the tip of Africa. Just the background of the country communities is that in 1949, Chief Rabbi Louis Rabinowitz, who was the chief rabbi at the time, saw the necessity for the establishment of a country communities department to offer and assist communities that were then already not able to fund their own rabbis and were diminishing. That's 1949. Because a lot of the people in the towns were married out of the faith, he felt that it couldn't be placed under the office of the chief rabbi because it, because of their, obviously their limitations. So it was placed with the Jewish Board of Deputies, whose role is to represent all Jews of South Africa. In 1949, there was over 40,000 Jews recorded in the country communities. And for 70 years, the Jewish Board of Deputies ran the country communities department. I'm the 7th rabbi to be doing this. And as you said, I've been doing it for 29 years. In 2019, the Board of Deputies felt that 1,300 Jews that were left in the country communities was not a viable department for them to run any longer, and the country communities department was closed, and we established something called the Small Jewish Communities Association, the SJCA, and that basically took over the role and the mandate of the once active country communities department, and I went with that, and we continued to maintain our regular visits, contact via email, WhatsApp, to our members all around South Africa. And also we established the African Jewish Congress, so we're responsible for Jewish communities in 9 African countries around sub-Saharan Africa. Now, what I just wanted to say was that I use Facebook and these avenues and channels to connect with people that have left South Africa. And initially, we've all been told to be careful of the dangers of social media, etc. But I think that if it's registered and used correctly and controlled, it is of great benefit and success. And the proof is that we have once I established the first Facebook page called Rav Moshe Silverhaft, the Traveling Rabbi, we had almost 5,000 people within a couple of weeks. And every month or so, I knock off 50 people that are not really active in responsive or liking, etc. I don't know if it's the right thing or not, and allow new people to come on. We have over 1,360 followers. We then established a Facebook page for the Small Jewish Communities Association with over 2,590 followers, and another one for the African Jewish Congress with almost 1,300 followers. The point is that we, as the community that is still alive here in South Africa, and the ones before us, and all of you that left, you were the midgets on the shoulders of giants. And as our first presenter this evening showed how people came to Upington, and he brought his family to work there to save them from Eastern Europe, etc., from other dangers. Try and remember for a minute, and I often say this and I get into trouble, but I tell you why I'm now comfortable to say this, is that just try and imagine 1929, 1895, Jews came here, the discovery of gold and diamonds. They were pushed out during the First World War, after the First World War, and they came to South Africa. They didn't know the language. They were not familiar with the climate, and they had never seen black people before. They didn't come with money, they didn't come with much experience, but they only came with the desire and the will to survive. And why do I say about them never seen black people before is we have a Jewish agency, Shaliach, who's an Ethiopian, and she came to speak to our Garden Route Jewish Association function a few Sundays ago, and she said that when they arrived to Israel from Ethiopia and they saw all these white people, they didn't believe that they were Jewish, and they thought that they were just people that were portraying themselves as Jews, and they couldn't be Jewish because they weren't black. So it's not a matter of white or black, it's a matter of what they were greeted with when they arrived at the ports in Lorenzo Marks or Durban, whatever it was, 1820 settlers in Algoa Bay. So it's important that we realize and we pay tribute and we acknowledge the incredible people that founded our community. And you were talking earlier, Roy, and I just made a note of two magnificent publications that have come out. One is on the Namibian Jewish community, and it's also basically all about individual families. You can page through, it's a thick book, and it's got details of thousands of Jewish families, pictures, and also their achievements. And the other one is Charlotte Wiener, who used to live in Petersburg, has published two books also on the second one in particular of prominent families and active families in the northern province, now called Limpopo. It's a magnificent publication. Families contributed. It was obviously checked that it was all verified, because you know what it is. People say, my father was the chairman, and the other one says, no, his father was the chairman, and we were the most kosher family, and the rabbi only ate at us, but no, he ate at somebody else as well. So those are fantastic publications, and people, if they're interested in them, and more of such publications should be put out and presented. And it's the individuals that we are interested, as well as communal life. And I don't know if people saw recently, we removed the foundation stone from the Rustenburg Shul, and we found a time capsule behind it. We removed which was 96 years old. We removed a time capsule from the Uitenhage Shul, which had coins over 120 years old, and the list of the committee and a letter from the governor, and et cetera, et cetera. So what we do is, when I travel around South Africa and Southern Africa, I post people I've met with a bit of a story about them, or just a picture of a cemetery, of an interesting experience, interesting research, interesting activities that we've done. And the amount of positive feedback, for those of you that know, if you host a Facebook page, you can see how many people how many people have seen the article, how many people the article has reached, should I say. And we can get up to 10,000 between 8 and 10,000 on an average visit to Zambia or Zimbabwe, or even along South African coastline, or whatever it is, or a farm, etc. There is huge interest in the South African Jewish history by people that have emigrated out of here. Also the sharing, people share. We have sometimes 30, 40, 50 sharing of articles, and people know that all our articles are freely allowed to be shared. In fact, this last week I was in Lusaka, Zambia, and I posted a picture of a cemetery of a man, Uri Rabinovitz, who died in 1917 from, I think it was called black water fever or something. He went up to Zambia to do business, and his daughter and son were from the African salt mines, and they came in 1997 to a rededication of this grave, which was lost since 1956. We eventually found it. I write about it in my book. David Schlepperberski, who's in Swellendam, writes on the Facebook page, that's my Zayda. So I phone him up and I say, what do you mean it's your Zayda? He explains that was his mother's father. And all of a sudden, there's this whole interest of people saying, hey, 1 second, but he's also my Zayda or my uncle, etc. And it starts off this massive networking of families that either never knew that they were families, or they had lost touch. Where have you been, etc., etc. And it's an incredible way of keeping this kind of history alive. We have, it's not all about cemeteries, obviously. We have lots of stuff that we do, activities, programs, projects, which we post as well. I wanted to say I was quite interested to the amount of people that mentioned about photographs of cemeteries. Over the years, we have accumulated digital photographs of almost every cemetery, almost every Jewish grave in Southern Africa. So if anybody wants to offer us a platform to host it, I'm happy to, you know, enter into an agreement with you and to make this available. I think it's essential that people understand the importance of the link of knowing that their family graves are still looked after. Unfortunately, maybe you guys get better interest through your work, but we get very, very few people contacting us to find out how the graves are of their parents. We look after over 30,000 Jewish graves in 220 Jewish cemeteries spread across sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm quite a sentimental person. Most people don't know that, but I think to myself, can you imagine people that have emigrated and have, I hate to use the word abandoned, but have kicked the stable door on their families' graves, etc. It costs nearly 3 million rand a year to maintain these cemeteries and these graves. We lay most of the headstones flat to avoid vandalism or damage in the event of vandalism. And there's very little input, very little interest to offer us funding for this. And I hope and pray that people that have emigrated, when they die, their children don't abandon their graves the way they've done it to them in South Africa. The thought that, yeah, somebody else will look after it, or there's a chevra, or there's a this or that, that's very, very insensitive. People have to show an interest and contact and say, please check on my Zayda's grave, or please check on my child's grave, and we'll send you $180, whatever it is. But there has to be, it's so un-Jewish to abandon Jewish family graves. So that, unfortunately, sometimes people don't like to hear it, but that's the reality. My question to the first presenter about the graves in Upington, what we now in a project is to find the names and information on all the unmarked graves. There are almost 4,000 unmarked Jewish graves in the country community cemeteries. And these are important, these are souls, these are human beings, these are Jews, which we need to try and find the information. And then what we do is we raise money to lay a small headstone with whatever information we can find off the death certificate. And so far we're doing quite well. But in many cases, there's no, they go to the local municipality, either the whole building's burned down because it's part of the previous regime, the apartheid regime, or they say, no, the Jews looked after their own death register, which in many cases, the Chevra Kadisha did have their own death register, and that is gone. So I was very encouraged to hear that there's 8 documents from the Upington community, which will assist us. Even if we're not familiar to put which name to which grave, we can still put up one stone that says the following 8 people are buried in 8 of the unmarked graves in the cemetery. And it gives these people's memory dignity, as well as they know no more lost. That's bad English, but they're not lost any longer. I also want to say that the volume 6 of the South African country communities, Jewish Life in the Country, has been published, and we're working on volume 7 already, Roy, so you need to get yourself volume 6. One thing I did find is that from all our speakers today is that a lot of people are doing a lot of research, and I'm wondering if there shouldn't be some kind of centralization. I don't know how it will happen, but this is something for you to discuss in future meetings, etc. To have some kind of centralization of all the information, because there's different websites for the different for the same information. I know a lot of people like to do their own thing and not share information, but I think at some point it should be centralized. Just coming back to Facebook, etc. We are extremely successful with it. People see our postings. Anybody that'd like to can go on and have a look. The first one is Rav Moshe Silverhaft, the traveling rabbi. The second one is Small Jewish Communities Association, South Africa. And the third one is African Jewish Congress. And there you can follow our movements, you can follow Jewish history. And it's, as I said, very, very well received. And it's most interesting, the comments that are made. And we get many times students that are doing family trees and they contact us, and it's beautiful to be able to assist them with this information. I'm going to close with just a story that we were talking about earlier. The first presenter spoke about how the Jewish shopkeepers and the Jewish businesses kept the towns going during droughts and et cetera, et cetera. So I was in the garden route recently for a function, and they were talking about the Oatson community, and they said that the Oatson community in the 1920s, 1910s was so powerful, and yet most of them were religious. There were 600 religious families. So on Shabbat, they were all in shul, they weren't at the bank. So the banks used to open on a Sunday for Jewish businesses to deposit money so they could trade and have money on the Monday. That's a true story, and that just shows the importance and the power of the Jewish economy and the Jewish influence. And we know of how in many towns, when Jews wanted to build shuls, the local churches offered money to assist with that, and in return as well, in reverse. When churches were built, often Jewish businessmen came forward and said, you know, we'd like to contribute to that. So definitely the South Africans in the last 200 years, or last whatever it was, made huge strides in every single town that they were in. They played massive roles, positive roles in the economies. And unfortunately, that's all coming to an end. But it's not only the country communities that are dwindling, the big cities as well. If anybody goes to any of the synagogues in the big cities, you'll see that they're winding down rapidly. But South Africa has been good to us for the last 200 years. So some of us are remaining, and we are committed to try and preserve the history. And any questions from anybody?
Thank you very much, Rabbi Silverhaft. That was really wonderful to hear how you on the ground are communicating and keeping things moving. So is there anybody who'd like to ask a question for Rabbi? I see Gwyn has her hand up again. Can we see your picture, do you think?
I just want to say that the Cape Jewish Board of Deputies looks after the Western Cape cemeteries. We spend a lot of money fixing them up, fixing up the walls. In some of the places, the shul has been given to the town to use as a museum on condition that the shul that the city council looks after the Jewish cemeteries. But you know, it's now a different cemetery, it's now a different council, it's got different priorities. It doesn't always happen. So if anybody wants to know anything about the country communities cemeteries, contact our director, Daniel B. at ctjc.co.za.
That's the Western Cape.
That's the Western Cape.
Thank you, Gwyn. Laura.
I just wanted to ask, if I wanted to donate some money, my grandparents are buried in Zimbabwe, how would I go about it?
I'll put my email address on the chat and you can email me.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else for the moment, or shall we continue now with, thank you again, Moshe. And now I'd like to ask Sean to talk to us. Now, Sean has worked in television as a director and cameraman for the past 30 years, produced and directed 19 short films for the permanent exhibition of the South African Holocaust and Genocide Foundation, and numerous exhibitions, films for the South African Jewish Museum. He worked a lot with Mendel Kaplan. I think that's a key part of this story. So, Sean, please talk to us about, you've called your talk Finding Signal in the Silence, Navigating South Africa's Film and Audio Archives.
Hi, good evening. Yes, it is very much finding signal in the silence. The silence is analog, and you know, today's modern signal is digital, and there's a divide. We have a colossal archive in this country because we have a very old film industry. It's as old as America, it's as old as anywhere. You know, Killarney Films, I.W. Schlesinger started 1913, 1914, even earlier. And a lot of what I'm going to talk about this evening has to do with I.W. Schlesinger, because any of you who are over 50 will recall African Mirror. You watched those African Mirror shorts before that feature film, and you watch those shorts in every small town in South Africa, in every big cinema in a major city. And in fact, African Mirror was the world's first filmed news service. And it was a unique record of the goings-on of South Africa from 1913 up until 1994. And as we all know, television came very late here. So news film lasted a great deal longer in this country than in other countries. Television finally torpedoed African Mirror in 1984. It went down, hardly anyone noticed. But in fact, it was the end of a quite extraordinary era. Going back a bit, I started in film and television in the late 80s. Mendel Kaplan gave me a break to direct documentary. He went back to Lithuania, to Latvia, to trace his relatives, and I got to make that film. And that led to a lot of interesting work with Mendel over the next 14 or 15 years. It only ended with his passing in 2009. But he handed me over to a lot of people over subsequent years, you know, prior to that. And one person I worked with, very lucky to work with, was Gavin Morris at the South African Jewish Museum. And in 2012, he commissioned me to make a film on the sculptor Herman Walt. Very good. What are we going to do now? We've got Herman Walt died in 1971, passed away. Where do you begin? You've got a collection of sculptures. How do you make a film on someone like that? Not so easy. It's you start with a blank slate. You know, you have a great deal of written records. You have a nice collection of photographs. You have some lovely sculptures, which you can film. You can put on a pedestal. You can rotate them. It looks very nice. You still don't have a film. He had two sons who gave us two very good interviews, which we were very grateful to have. But we still don't have a film, I felt. We have an interesting collection of film clips now. I went to C.S. Scott at the South African Broadcasting Corporation. I said, have you ever heard of Herman Walt? And he said, yes, of course I have. African Mirror shot a film on him. I said, you must be kidding. I said, yes, they did in 1959, when his monument to the martyrs was unveiled at West Park Cemetery. And he thinks that film is still somewhere. I said, CS, find that film. And we looked and we looked and we looked. It turned up in a tin can. And it was a wonderful clip. 45 seconds, several thousand people at West Park Cemetery. Anyone who was there. And that film clip made that film. It was what we call in the film world the money shot. You know, there's a time in every film where you don't know, are you going to have a film here? Is there enough to make a film? But when I saw that shot, I knew I had a movie, and it really made that film. And it, you know, it was like as a filmmaker, it's a very fine moment when you find something and you know you've got it. And that film clip made that film. And that was where I discovered African Mirror as a resource. And that led to a very fruitful series of films with Gavin. Subsequently, we made a film on the Jews of District 6. And again, lots of photographs, lots of documents, some very nice interviews. Where are we going to find contemporary footage? We found it, African Mirror. You know, often things were filmed not for the reasons we're using them for now. You know, they filmed slum clearance, so-called slum clearance, where they demolished homes. But the cameras were there in the 50s and the 60s, and we found that footage, and that made that film. You know, again, we were able to hang so much footage around, so many interviews around that footage. You know, we'd show that footage to people, and that would stimulate responses, and we'd film those responses. But, you know, if we didn't have that original footage, we would never have got those responses from those people. You know, so I found that very exciting as a filmmaker. Another film, a much more recent one, some of you might have attended it, was Mavericks Inside the Tent. It was a history of Reform Judaism in South Africa. Now, crumbs, where do I begin here? Again, wonderful records of the Jewish Board of Deputies, wonderful sets of photographs at the shuls. Where do I find film footage? I went looking, and it was quite extraordinary. You know, as you know, Rabbi Moses Cyrus Weiler was brought out to South Africa, or should I say sent out by Lady Montagu to found Reform Judaism here. Quite incredibly, in 1935, we found 2 minutes of footage of Rabbi Weiler laying the foundation stone of temporal Israel in Hillbrow. And that made our film. And we looked further, and we found more footage of Rabbi Weiler opening Temple Shalom in 1950 in Highlands, Temple Israel in Port Elizabeth in 1953. These extraordinary visual records, and they were all beautifully shot in 35mm black and white film. Now, Arthur Schlesinger sent out his film crews. They used feature film cameras with prime lenses. The footage is pin sharp. It really is pin sharp. And it looks, some of it looks like it was shot yesterday. And all this footage made a quite extraordinary contribution to the films I made. You know, I owe a lot to I.W. Schlesinger. He seemed to cover an enormous amount of Jewish communal activities out of all proportion to a lot of other things he filmed. I don't know why he did that. Subconsciously, perhaps he was trying to create a record, but this stuff has survived, and it is, I think, historically very, very valuable. The big problem is a lot of it has not been digitized. You know, we would find the material in tin cans, and we would have to get it out, acclimatize it, because it's stored under quite cold conditions. It takes 3 days to warm up to room temperature. And now our national archives no longer have transfer facilities. So we had to send it out to private labs. You know, so whatever we find, we digitize. But I'm acutely aware that there's a lot of stuff we haven't found and haven't digitized. But Trevor Moses at the National Archives has now produced a catalog of all the material there. And there is some extraordinary stuff. And I've compiled a short list. I went through about 2,500 film clips and identified about 100 pertaining to the Jewish community. 90% of these have never been seen. They've never been digitized. I think they should be, and I hope we find the funding to do so. I'm just going to pick a sample of some of them. Unfortunately, the film clips from 1913 to 1919 have been lost. Who knows what happened? They're gone. It's a tragedy. But from 1920 onwards, they've survived. They're sitting in film cans. Most haven't been watched. But, you know, I'm just going to look at the list from 1920, and I think you'll find this interesting. There was a film clip in 1920, and the title is Jewish Celebrations in Johannesburg on the Return to Palestine. And I suspect this film footage is of the first group of South African Jews making Aliyah to Palestine in the wake of the Balfour Declaration, 3 or 4 years later. That same year, there were Zionist celebrations in Cape Town, another 2-minute film, which is still sitting in a tin can. Haven't been able to see it. Another film in 1922, focused on the British mandate over Palestine. All these films have been made, and we haven't had a chance to view them, and I think we should. On a related topic, the chief rabbi of the British Empire comes to Cape Town in 1921. A film was made of that. Again, it's never been digitized. No one has seen it since 1921. I don't think anyone's watched that film in 100 years, but it's there. You know, if you go on through this list, you see the ratification of the Palestine Mandate is celebrated. I don't know what that means. Maybe that was a formal function, but I know it's a movie and I know it exists. If you go on forward to 1932, there's a film on the artist Moses Kotler, has an exhibition of his works in Pretoria. No one's ever seen this film. It's sitting in a tin can. In 1934, General Smuts lays the foundation stone of the synagogue in Sea Point. But apparently that's a 5-minute film. I presume that's a Marero Shul. I stand to be corrected, but it's, I think, you know, people would like to see those films. It's another film, 1935, Jewish athletes depart for the Maccabee Games in Palestine. I'm sure if you screen that film, you would recognize a lot of people in it. I, for one, would like to see it. That same year, Rabbi Weiler lays the foundation stone of Temple Israel in Hillbrow. That film I have digitized. I have used it. It is in the Jewish Digital Archive project in Leila has that in Cape Town. You can view that film there. 1937, Reverend Abraham inducted as the chief rabbi of Cape Town. I think he succeeded Rabbi Bender, if memory serves me correct. That film is there. 1940, the tragedy of the invasion of Poland is depicted at an exhibition in Cape Town. 1941, the Great Synagogue in Cape Town hosts a service for soldiers about to go to North Africa. Now, that film I've shown to several people, and people are recognized there. The other big project I used African Mirror for was for a documentary I did for the Irma Stern Museum. And everyone said to me, there's no footage in Irma Stern, nothing, no radio, nothing. I never believe what I'm told when people tell me these things, because I very much enjoy searching, looking, finding things. I especially like looking for things that I'm told don't exist. So I went back to African Mirror, and incredibly, we found footage. And I couldn't find the references. I couldn't find the log sheets were incomplete. And I phoned Freddie Ochterop, whom I'm sure is all well known to you. And he said, yes, there's a related collection. Bureau of Information, film number 5. You'll find Irma Stern painting a portrait. My goodness, he was right. We went off to the archives. We found a rusty old tin. There was that footage, perfect condition. And it forms a major part of the film I made for the Irma Stern Museum. It was such a find. Again, you know, without that footage, I wouldn't have had a film. I had wonderful interviews with people who knew Irma Stern. I had wonderful photographs, but I didn't have Irma Stern herself. And, you know, to find that footage made that film. And it was a very, how can I say, gratifying discovery for me. But that film had no sound. It was silent. We couldn't, I don't know why, we couldn't find the soundtrack. We just had the footage, lovely as it was. So I went back to the SABC and I reasoned, someone must have interviewed her in the 40s and 50s when she was famous. Had to. And Corinne du Toit, bless her soul, said, yes, of course, we've got 3 radio interviews of Irma Stern. and they were in perfect technical condition, even though they'd never been digitized. They were still analog, they were crackly. We digitized them, we cleaned them up, and we found enough footage there for Irma Stern to narrate her own film. We did not need a narrator. Irma does it herself. You can see that film at the Irma Stern Museum. You know, it's very exciting working like that. You know, you start a project, you've got nothing, you think you're not going to get anything, and then suddenly you've got something, and then suddenly you've got something great. And for me, as a filmmaker, I find that extremely satisfying. Finally, Gavin came back to me for yet another project on Ali Bacher, which is just, in fact, still running at the Jewish Museum. We've made 7 short films there. And again, what footage are we going to find? Television only started here in 1976. Went back to the list. I went back to the catalogue. And there it says, South Africa's greatest day ever. Ali Bacher hits 235 against Australia. Now I thought, well, they must have sent a film crew there. There's no way. It takes 2 days to hit century. It takes longer than that to hit 2 centuries. Someone went to film him. And yes, we found footage of Ali Bacher hitting 235 against Australia, filmed in black and white. And Ali Bacher had never seen that footage. So I flew up to Joburg and I ambushed him. I went to his house, I played it to him, and he watched himself hitting 235, and I filmed his reaction doing that. And that makes a wonderful part of that film. So, yes, I like working with archive footage. South Africa has a fabulous collection of material. It is badly under-resourced, in spite of the fact that there are very good people looking after it. Trevor Moses is doing a great job at the National Archives. He has a collection of aging film. The splices are becoming brittle. The footage itself is becoming fragile. Where we can, we digitize. It's stored under pretty good conditions for now, but film has a finite life, 60 or 70 years, 70 years and 10, like the biblical 70 years and 10, then it goes. If you don't digitize, you're dead. Analog has a finite service life. So SABC is the other big repository of material. They have similar problems, wonderful material. A lot of it's analog, it's never been digitized. For a filmmaker, it's a challenge, but this country is blessed in what it has. And I am trying to raise funding to digitize so much of what has not been digitized for posterity, because we have a filmmaking tradition here going back a century. It is wonderfully rich, and I would like to save as much of it as I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. What an exciting and opening our eyes presentation. And I think we all can't wait to see not only your films, but your future films when you've got more of this information and stuff digitized. So, you know, I hope that this project and this dream of yours will come true. Gwyn, you wanted to say something.
The Sea Point CHOL will be turning 100 soon. I'm quite sure if they were told, they would love to digitize General Smuts opening it. I did the history of the CHOL and I found photographs and newspaper cuttings about it. I'm quite sure they'd be very happy, because when it comes to their centenary in a few years' time, they'll want to do it's the largest synagogue in Africa. Israel is turning 75 next year. If you were to approach the Zionist Fed, I'm quite sure they might be prepared to go and digitize some of these films to do a film to celebrate South Africa's connection. Last week, I went to a private showing at the Artscape of a film called Grandfather, Your Right Foot is Missing. Grandfather is Table Mountain, and the right foot is District 6. It was filmed by a colored filmmaker in the 1960s. And an imam at an interfaith group district group I belong to, told us about it. We looked for it, and as you said, we found it in a tin can. We had it digitized, and we had a special showing of it. It shows amazing footage of District 6 being destroyed. And I agree with you. These things are shriveling up there, and we need to find people. And if you find people who are celebrating something like an centenary, they'd be prepared to find the money to go and do so. And if I can help you with contacts, I'd do so happily. I think it's very important.
Well, look, I'm very glad to hear that, Gwen. I can assure you I've established this. General Smuts was there. That footage does exist. In my experience, it's all extremely good condition. They've kept it refrigerated. They just haven't had the chance to digitize it. You know, it's still on original negative. But I've never pulled a piece that I couldn't work with. All the material is still workable with, I can tell you that. And that's good news.
Yep, that's wonderful. Michael Britton, would you like to say something?
Yes, firstly, I'd like to thank Sean for such an interesting presentation. Thank you so much. Last year, I was researching the visit of the Lithuanian-American violinist Jascha Heifetz to South Africa in 1932. And he was born in Vilna, and my father, in fact, was born shortly after that. And they grew up in Vilna for a few years before they both, of course, left. Heifetz toured South Africa in 1932, and a newsreel film was made of his arrival in Cape Town. And he connected with the Jewish community in the course of his tour of South Africa. And also, of course, the Jewish community were huge supporters of his concerts wherever he went. Now, I'm just wondering what the chances are, the probabilities are of that newsreel movie, which presumably was done by a Schlesinger organization group. What is the probability that that newsreel still exists? And I have the information about the newsreel, what's on it. I know the exact date. I know when it was shown in the local cinema, or should I say bioscope maybe. And if I can provide that information, would you be able to tell whether that news clip might still exist?
I'll be able to do that very quickly. If you could forward me that information, I will find out. The log sheets are quite incomplete, but do, and I will certainly check for you. Because that sounds just like the sort of thing that would have been filmed. It was very much the sort of thing that I.W. Schlesinger would have covered.
How do I get in touch with you, Sean?
My email address, I think it will be on the round robin for this Zoom. It will be there. And what I can do is I can upload the entire provisional list I've made if anyone's interested in seeing that.
Yep, that would be excellent. Now we have this interactive email list that if you've registered for this, if you'd like to be on it, that's a really good way of being able to see this. And we can publish a lot of these resources on that for you to look at. I think, Sean, I've put you onto that list.
Great, thank you.
I don't know if you're on it, Michael, but I can add you, or you can join it yourself.
Yeah, I have registered, so I don't know if that automatically puts me on the list or not, but I'd certainly love to be on the list.
If you've registered for this talk and you're willing to be on the list, I can get those emails and put them on the list, because I think that's a good way for you to be able to communicate with each other. It's, you know, it's not as fussy as Facebook. It's just an email list where you can communicate with everybody.
But do get in touch. I'll be able to find out for you within a few days.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I think we've had 4 absolutely wonderful presentations covering a wide variety of ways that we're making sure that the digitized virtual communities of South Africa, individuals, are not forgotten, and finding ways to preserve them in a good way. And I think, you know, clearly one of the things about Community History Online is we'd like to be a sort of portal where, as Rabbi Silverhaft says, we need somewhere where you can go, where you can see where everything is. Well, there's probably a bit too much, but, you know, with Google and things like that, we can do. So I'd really just love to thank all of you, Bramie, to thank Roy, Moshe, and Sean for such exciting and interesting presentations. And it's really been lovely. We have another session next week, which is back at the 2 o'clock South African time, and 4 more engrossing speakers, hopefully. I'm going to be speaking next week on a reunion of the medical school graduates of Wits from 1960 and how we managed to put them together and document their life stories. So we're also talking about Cape Town Jewish medical practitioners, and it should be a very interesting session for you, and I hope you will join us then. So on behalf of all of us, thank you so much, Rabbi, Sean, Roy, and Bramie, and look forward to seeing you next week. Bye now.